Hello, my name is Thomas Foldis, and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2021 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. What is sleep-dependent memory consolidation? While memory encoding and retrieval generally occur during the periods of wake, sleep appears to facilitate the consolidation of newly encoded information through a unique hormonal, physiological, and behavioral environment. Consequently, figuring out how sleep contributes to memory is not easy. In this presentation, I will focus on one component, reactivation and replay. This was first discovered in rodents. Researchers found a strong correlation between the firing rates of place cell neurons during sleep to those observed during the waking task, with later studies noting a temporal order to this reactivation referred to as replay. These patterns were later found in humans as well, with a causal link emerging between reactivation and consolidation, especially thanks to studies employing a paradigm called targeted memory reactivation. In these studies, sounds or scents are associated with a specific newly learned information, and these same sensory stimuli are gently presented during sleep to participants in hopes of triggering reactivation. Which experiences and which subparts of selected experiences are replayed in natural sleep remains an open question. While many factors have been implicated in this selection process, such as encoding, strength, reward, emotional valence, there is tentative evidence that this selective replay allows for relevant memories with shared components to be blended or differentiated from each other that could result in improved generalization and construction of schemas observed in some studies. There are many ways to study the process of generalization and its relationship to sleep. Learn and Gluck in their recent systematic review focus on tasks in which regularities depend on associative relations between newly learned stimuli, and the authors argue that it's early to conclude that sleep effects broadly define generalization. Instead, it might be more useful to disentangle the particular types of influence on a task-by-task basis. They identified two major patterns when looking at more than 50 studies examining the sleep effect in learning hidden regularities, one being temporal predictability to the regularity. So this is the temporal prediction of an item shown at time point 1 to an item being shown at time point 2. And the second was task effects. So they find that while certain task design seems to be replicable with respect to the sleep effect, when different tasks are grouped together according to the processes that are assumed to underlie them, the results become mixed. Building on these observations, we wanted to find a formal framework that could model an initial set of experiments that we found important for a potential reactivation-based model to account for, and explore the relationship with this model between reactivation and generalization as defined by Lerner and Group. And these tasks will be the paired associate task, its effect on sleep, the transitive inference, and the serial reaction time task. In search of models connecting reactivation and generalization, we first came across a model called REMERGE, which is an acronym for Recurrency and Episodic Memory Results in Generalization by Kumaran and McClelland. It's presented as a hybrid of exemplar models and spreading activation models, so the activity of a unit in the network's conjunctive layer at each time step reflects the similarity of the corresponding exemplar to the current pattern of activity in the feature layer. A crucial difference between remerge and exemplar models is a recurrent mechanism that enables this similarity-based inference to be performed not only on external presented sensory inputs, but also on the feature layer inputs reconstructed by the network. And this mechanism the authors refer to as recurrent similarity computation. Here we see the model representing the transitive inference task, where in the learning phase participants are shown pairs of n items, here 6, and in the testing phase, people are tested on being able to assess the rank order relationship between adjacent, such as BC, or non-adjacent items, such as BD. And there's a number of free parameters that control this recurrent activation. And what's interesting here is that the authors also provide an example of the model accounting for sleep-dependent memory consolidation effects. So they argue that this model, just by strengthening the already existing connections between the feature layer and the conjunctive layer, is able to account for the sleep effect observed in the transitive inference task, where in a study by Ellenbogen in 2007, participants have improved their inferential performance in this task, while their performance was constant with respect to the premise pairs, and we see the model being able to account for this by doing just this one manipulation in its weight matrix. The model has been constructed with a specific goal in mind, which is to account for hippocampal-dependent rapid generalization. So this is improvement in inferential performance that is happening in a short time span starting from initial encoding. It also assumes that reactivation is always generalized, meaning that all exemplars stored in the conjunctive layer get activated to a certain extent during replay. And it ascribes to an associating model of learning, meaning that learning proceeds by strengthening existing connections, both awake and sleep. During our use of this model, we've noticed some important limitations, one being that there's no proposed learning algorithm for how the connections are formed between the feature layer and the conjunctive layer. Furthermore, it is not clear how one would model tasks where a priori conjunctive nodes aren't obvious from the task structure, so these would be tasks involving semantic memory, spatial cognition, or statistical learning. And we've also found the model to be very sensitive to initial conditions, meaning if the weight matrix isn't uniform or the input strengths are diverging, the model seems to act somewhat chaotically. In an attempt to account for these limitations, we wanted to explore how reactivation would look like in a purely exemplar model. So similar to the remerge, a number of computational models have been developed that propose that recognition operates by a process of global matching, wherein the queue is compared to each stored memory. We initially looked at Minerva by Hintzman. The model assumes that memory traces are a list of features encoding an event, and each event is encoded as a unique trace. Memory is treated as a matrix with one row for each studied event and one column for each feature. Additionally, to account for noisy encoding, there's a pre-parameter probability with which an element is stored correctly or not. So during queued recall, the system returns a new memory trace called an echo, which is a weight composite of all the traces with respect to their activation strengths. And memory traces with a greater overlap will have more weight and thus a greater influence over the contents of the echo, creating a generalized schema-like output. Well, while the similarity function ensures that highly active dominant traces influence the echo content the most, it will still be a composite of several memories, which leads to a gradual distortion of traces when stored. However, when we run the system in a recurrent fashion, what we see in the subplot C, by reintroducing the echo as a queue, we can see the model gradually performing even actually a more accurate retrieval as it activates a smaller and smaller set of memories. And this resembles overall resembles a recurrent similarity computation similar to remerge. A notable advantage of Minerva and vector symbolic models in general is their flexibility in choosing different functions for each step of the queuing procedure. So while the original Minerva uses cosine similarity as its similarity function and the cubic function as its activation function, we additionally explore Parsons similarity function in an attempt to achieve pattern separation behavior, not just pattern completion behavior. And we also explore the effect of different exponents. So with higher exponents, items in memory that are further from the probe become progressively less similar, thus more similar items will dominate the global similarity computation. It's also important to note the assumptions that Minerva makes about reactivation, and while these are still an open question whether they apply to sleep-dependent reactivation, we consider them an ideal baseline assumption for future research. So just to recap, in the transitive inference task and relational learning in general, we attempt to measure the ability to infer indirect associations between stimuli after learning their direct relations to each other. Participants are presented with pairs of stimuli drawn at random from an ordered list and are rewarded for selecting the correct item. The stimulus is correct if its rank order is lower than the distractor with which it is pairs. And here we first wanted to see whether Minerva as an encoding-based overlap model of generalization can account for this behavior observed in the Ellenbogen study, similar to remerge, and indeed we found that it could when it was ran recurrently. While most implementations of the model can do close pair, meaning 1 degree separated, B larger than D type inferences, when performing inferences for distant pairs, so B larger than E, only the original model improves over recurrent iterations. Throughout the whole presentation, we model sleep-dependent reactivation as the model running recurrently after spontaneously activating memory is acquired during wake. And also important to note is that we see Minerva correlation that is using a Parsons similarity function in the second column, and Minerva x1, x2, x3 using activation functions with larger than 3 exponents. I would also like to note that by no means is Minerva the only encoding-based model to perform such inferences recurrently. However, we do argue that it's one of the most parsimonious models to our knowledge to do so. We're looking at paired association to test the hypothesis that sleep protects memories from subsequent interference. Alan Dogan and colleagues employed an AB-AC interfering word pair paradigm. In the original design, participants are taught a list of AB word pairs. A subset of these are later associated with AC word pairs, inducing retroactive interference with respect to the AB pairings. And researchers hypothesized that if sleep plays an active protective role in stabilizing labile memory traces, learning the interfering pairs after a period of sleep would result in interference being less disruptive when compared to a period of wake. And indeed, they find that, as we see in the empirical subplot. And we were able to show a similar pattern when running Minerva recurrently in a pattern separating mode with a Parsons similarity function complemented by different exponents. We were able to replicate similar patterns. Here we see detailed model simulations with varying memory strength and uniform noise over different recurrent iterations. So columns are split by encoding strength of each word pair. On average, rows are split by a scale variable controlling the magnitude of uniform noise added to the feature vectors encoding word pairs. The x-axis shows the iterative evolution of how average cosine similarity between A, B, and BC word pair echoes change over time step. And higher value means they become more similar over time. Lower value means they become more distinguishable. And the error bar indicates one standard error of mean. And we can see that there is a range of parameters where we see the Minerva cosine and the Minerva core diverge. In the SRT task, participants react to a small number of events as quickly and accurately as they can, and events appear in one of 4 horizontal locations, and responses usually require participants to press keys that spatially match these positions. In the Cousins TMR study, participants learned 2 4-finger button pressing sequences in which each finger was associated with a specific auditory tone, and 4 separate tones, higher or lower in pitch, were used for each sequence. To cue memory replay, the tones associated with one sequence were replayed to participants either during sleep or before sleep. They found a significant improvement in the experimental group when TMR is used to cue one of the sequences with respect to accuracy and RT. Minerva 2 does not have a mechanism with which to simulate response time, so to estimate it, we used an idea from the iterative resonance model and applied it to Minerva's retrieval mechanism for cue recognition. So on the first time step, the exponent in the activation function is set to 1, and on successive iterations, the exponent in the activation function increases by 1. That exaggerates the differences in similarity of the probe to each trace, as discussed earlier in the slide about activation functions. By counting how many iterations it takes the model to find memory trace that corresponds to the decision threshold of the model, we see that the model appears to exhibit a pattern of results similar to the experimental group versus the control group. When looking at sleep-dependent replay more closely, as defined by the model spontaneously activating its already stored memories in a pattern completing mode and integrating these reactivations into its memory space, here starting at block 6 in red. When comparing to a model that does equal butts of externally cued learning, we see that the results are much more varied, but interestingly, there is again a parameter range where the uniform noise and the decision threshold in synchrony can result in performance that is comparable to equal number of wakeful learning blocks. In summary, we believe that Minerva is an ideal baseline model for sleep and memory researchers informing testable hypotheses about reactivation-based generalization, as it is a very parsimonious and easy to use model and has a broad explanatory range, as we see in the types of tasks that we could use it for. And also it uses a recurrent similarity-based computation similar to remerge, but in a vector symbolic framework. On the disadvantages, it is a single system model of memory reactivation, so it doesn't have a separate store for semantic memories and episodic memories, which might have different replay dynamics. It is somewhat of a hassle to use it for modeling reaction time, and it also has difficulties with accounting for temporal regularities, although it can be shoehorned in. But for models that have more detailed view on interference, this could provide a crucial limitation. Recent research seems to be closing in on the boundary conditions of when reactivation leads to pattern separation versus pattern completion. And given earlier work that was able to adjudicate between competing exemplar models using neuroimaging data, this seems the right time to design and apply these kinds of models to sleep data as well. Thank you for listening.